It's been a great conference, hasn't it? You really enjoyed this? We had Louis Gohmert show up on the radio program yesterday, and I just had to say, well, Louis, your best friend actually stepped down. Remember when his buddy, remember that? Eric Holder said, hey, don't go there, buddy. So I said, well, you guys are BFF now, aren't you? And he said, yeah, and I now that he's looking for a job, I have a good one, and that would be maybe for him to go and find all of those guns in South America and see if he can bring them back. So that was the job he wanted to give to him. And then a little bit later, we were talking about the importance of micro-targeting and all the things that are happening in the Republican Party. And he said, you know, there's really one group that we really, as Republicans, need to target, and that's dead people. Because if you notice, dead people always vote for Democrats, you know, so we need to figure out a way to get them. And it reminded me of last time I was with William F. Buckley when he was here in Texas. He said, well, the time before he'd been in West Texas, and he said, I went to this one town and they told me something I did know, and that is my great uncle was in that town. And they told me something else about my great uncle that I knew, and that is he served as sheriff. But then they told me something I didn't know, and that is 3 years after he died, he voted for Lyndon Johnson. So we've got some things to do, obviously. And what I want to try to do in the short time that we have here is to look at some of these family issues. And what I would like to do is also make available to any of you, if you would like the material you're going to see on the screen, back on our table there, you can just give us your email and I'll send you a PDF file. So you can steal everything I'm going to use in the next couple of minutes. Is that a good deal? I want to thank Neil and Bill and Diane and all of you that serve in the Republican Party. We certainly appreciate all that you do. And to give you a little bit of a sense of where we're going to go, here's how I'm going to do it. We'll look at some of the trends that I think favor pro-family voters. Talk a little bit about kind of the history of Christian influence, because if we're going to be really successful in all these family voter issues, we're going to have to encourage people in the church, starting sometimes with the pastors, to get involved in some of these issues. And then finally, maybe just talk a little bit about some of those contemporary issues. And then Diane's going to come up here and talk about one of those issues in more detail, and that is the end-of-life issues, if that helps you understand a little bit more. So first of all, looking at some of the trends, and for those of you taking notes, there'll be 7 of those. And I recognize there are a lot of negative trends. Right now, Democrats seem to be outspending Republicans. The Democratic Party can depend on a favorable media. In terms of micro-targeting, I think they've done a little bit better there. So I'm mindful of the negatives. Are you ready for some positives? Okay, I want to give you some positives. So let's look at a few of those. And the first one is what I'll call a geographic trend. And that is people move around quite a bit. And I'm not just talking about people that drove off on a U-Haul. I'm talking about what has become kind of the geographic realignment of America. And in general, the population has been flowing kind of from the snow belt to the sun belt, but it's really a lot more complex than that. And so I want to get into the details a little bit more, because if you want to look at that, we certainly in the state of Texas have seen our fast growth rates, but also in the Rocky Mountain states and some of the South Atlantic states. And if you look at this, interestingly enough, the growth rate in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia is much higher than in the West Coast states of California, Oregon, and Washington. She was just in California talking about Oakland. I can relate to that. I was born in Berkeley, California. Berkeley, California. I can tell you that Grapevine is a little different than Berkeley, California, although it does feel a little bit like Austin when I'm down there. But nevertheless, we can see that this is changing the demographics. Look at what is happening in some of these so-called interior boom towns. Dallas is now larger than San Francisco. Houston, larger than Boston. Charlotte, larger than Milwaukee. The Rust Belt, in many ways, is really collapsing today, and so we can begin to see what is happening there as well. So the first thing is that geographic realignment, and that has certainly given us a lot more power, as illustrated by my second point, and that is we've had a census, you know, and a few years ago we're going to have it again. But the winners were, of course, Texas and Florida and other states. The losers were some of those others. So you see more and more people moving into those red states. And when you begin to talk about the impact that that could certainly have on presidential elections, that's positive. Now, I recognize a negative. When a person moves from Illinois to Texas or from New York to Georgia, sometimes they bring some of those values. So I recognize that's not always a positive, but there's also an enculturation that takes place as well. They come down here and say, you know what, I am so used to paying state income tax in New York, And it's kind of fun to be in the state of Texas and not pay a state income tax. Maybe that's a better idea. So sometimes they come here and bring their values, but sometimes we're able to convert them as well. And so it's kind of an interesting way in which that plays itself out. But the third thing is really the point I want to make, and that is when we look at this geographical realignment, a lot of it has to do with taxation. And this study, interestingly enough, comes from United Van Lines. Because they're trying to figure out, who's renting and who's moving, and U-Haul's worked at this as well. And if you are from California, as I have been, of course I've lived in Texas now all these years, you notice something very interesting. And that is if you want to rent a U-Haul truck and go to California, it costs you a whole lot less than if you want to rent one in California and come to Texas. Because there are a lot of people leaving California, see the point? And so obviously they have recognized something very interesting. And interesting enough, about 20,000 Americans relocate every single day. And what we're finding is yes, generally they're moving from the Rust Belt states to the Sun Belt states. But it's a little more interesting than that, and that is when you begin to look at that, what is really happening in most cases is they're moving from high income tax states to states that have little or no income taxes. As a matter of fact, they found that families are leaving these 6 states: Michigan, New York, New Jersey, South Dakota, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. What do those all have in common? They look kind of blue, don't they? What's so interesting is consider that the 8 states that have no income tax, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, Wyoming, every one of them gained net domestic migrants, and all but one, with the exception of Florida, ranked in the top 12. But it's even more specific than that. If you look at North Dakota, South Dakota, now, I've been in North Dakota and South Dakota. Bill mentioned that I've spoken on college campuses, and I always end up at the University of North Dakota in February. I don't know what that is, but anyway, that's the way it is. But I don't know if anybody's here from the Dakotas, but really, there's not a whole lot of difference between North Dakota and South Dakota. But here's the difference. Up until this latest energy boom, people were moving out of North Dakota in droves. But where were they moving to? South Dakota. And people from other states like Minnesota were moving into South Dakota. What was going on? North Dakota has a state income tax. South Dakota does not have a state income tax. Very interesting. An example is you can look at the state of California. I'm from there, the land of the fruit and nuts. We know all about that. And people are leaving California in droves. Where are they going to? A large percentage of them are going to Nevada. What does Nevada have? No state income tax. You can begin to see how this is beginning to play out on a national level. Let's look at one more, and that is to look even at the growth rates. Some of those growth rates relate to taxes, but certainly, again, just if you are interested in numbers, and I've given you quite a few, which is why you probably want to get the PDF, because you probably can't write fast enough. But if you look at the 8 states that have no income tax, they grew, the most recent figures I've got, by 18%. But if you look at the other states, they only grew by 8%. Now, there are people in some of those states that are kind of looking and saying, what's going on in Texas here? Of course, they're not just looking down there. The current governor of the state of Texas seems to be showing up in some of those states, saying, come on down, we have a much better business environment. And if it's not just the issue of taxes, look at this one. There's a diagram there of the right to work states compared to other states. The right to work states, those 22 states that have a right to work laws, grew by 15%. The other states grew by only 6%. You getting a trend here? Only looked at 4. Let's look at a couple more real quickly because, again, we can look at something else, and that is the issue of collective bargaining. Governor Scott Walker dealing with that in the last couple of years. He's got a very tight race in Wisconsin right now, but 16 states where collective bargaining with public employees is not required grew by 15%. What happened in the rest of the states? Only grew by 7%. Now, if you're a legislator or a governor, you've got to be aware of some of those statistics, and if not, you can take my PDF and send it to some of those individuals because they can begin to see that they are pushing their states in the wrong direction, and we're pushing our state in what? The right direction. Just a couple more real quickly. And then we'll get into some of the issues. And that is, there is another real interesting demographic switch, and it's a political one, and it's been written about by both conservatives and liberals. Arthur Brooks, with the American Enterprise Institute, wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal called The Fertility Gap. You can do a Google search, because after all, what? Google knows all. And you can find it and read it in more detail. But Philip Longman is a progressive. He calls himself a liberal progressive, wrote a book a while back called The Empty Cradle. And they're both recognizing the same thing. And that is, if you just went out right now and you talked to 100 unrelated, politically liberal adults at random, they would have among them about 147 children. If you then went out and talked to 100 unrelated conservatives, you would find they have 208 kids among them. That is a fertility gap of 41%. That's why a liberal, progressive, Philip Longman says, we've got a problem. First of all, we liberals don't have a lot of children, and then some of the children we could have had, we abort. And so as a result, we are seeing a shrink in the potential liberals of the future. Now, we also recognize that children generally fall an 80-20 rule. That is, if you grew up in a home where your parents are Republican, there's an 80% likelihood that when you register, you'll register as a Republican. And if you grew up in a household where your parents were registered Democrat, an 80%. And so as a result, we can see that this fertility gap means something rather dire for the Democratic Party and for liberals in the future, because it doesn't budge when you look at age or income or education, sex, race, or religion. And what we are basically concluding is there's a lot more little Republicans or future Republicans than there are little Democrats. What does that mean? You begin to run the numbers, and you can begin to see that if this trend continues, some of these so-called purple states, let's take Ohio. That's about as 50-50 as you can get. If you run those numbers and that trend continues, they estimate that by 2020 could be what? A 59-41 state. In other words, this purple state turns red. Now, again, I'll be the first to admit that there are some forces in this culture working hard to turn Republicans into Democrats. I speak on university college campuses, so I can tell you that that's certainly the case. So I'm not minimizing that. I recognize the pop culture and all the rest. But you do begin to see at least the possibility that some of those trends are breaking towards us. Again, I'd wonder how many of you have heard anybody ever talk about that in the mainstream media. That's one of those hidden secrets that people, even in the Democratic Party, know, but don't really want to talk about too much, because you can see how that plays out. Got a couple of young people here today. You know the statistic. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life in America. That's not what Planned Parenthood expected. Planned Parenthood expected after 1973 Roe versus Wade that a whole generation growing up with abortion being legal, that they would just take that for granted. Yet the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. So we can begin to see some remarkable changes there. Two more trends, and we'll get into some other topics. Another one is just a simple economic trend. People are becoming more and more concerned about things like the federal deficit, the national debt. They're concerned about our balance of trade deficits and those kinds of things. In one of the books we have in the back here on money that I've written about, I talk about Warren Buffett. If you listen to my talk show, you probably don't hear me quote Warren Buffett too positively too often, but he does have a great illustration that I think makes our point. And that is, he says, imagine you have two islands here that are pretty much self-sufficient, and you have one that's called Thriftville and one that's called Squanderville. And the people in Squanderville recognize that people in Thriftville produce a little bit more, so they begin to buy some of the things from Thriftville, and they actually pay for them with squander bucks, and eventually they actually then create squander bonds and buy more and more from Thriftville. And Squanderville likes that because they don't have to work so hard, and so Thriftville begins to sell more and more. But after a while, the people in Thriftville say, well, these squander bonds may not be worth a lot, so they use these squander bucks and squander bonds to buy land in Squanderville, and eventually then Thriftville not only owns Thriftville, but it owns Squanderville. Now, when I talk about that, some people say, that seems like countries that I know. Who do you think Thriftville is? China fits into that category. Japan fits into that category. Does anybody have to guess who Squanderville is? Not hardly. And that's what I think a lot of Americans are starting to say. We cannot let these Democrats spend us into oblivion. And as a result, we have gone from being, as I talk about in my book on money, the largest creditor nation in the world back in the 1980s and the 1970s to the largest debtor nation in the world with $17 trillion in debt. And even the low information voter recognizes this as well. And a recent Gallup poll asked, what are the biggest threats facing America? Number one was the economy in general. Number two was the federal budget deficit. And number three was dissatisfaction with government. Does that bode well for a big government Democrat? I don't think so. And I think it, again, is one of those positive trends for us. And one last one real quickly. Seventh trend is a technological trend. And that is, today we have a lot more alternative media. When Marlon Maddox started Point of View back in 1972, isn't that amazing? He started that back in 1972. When he went up on satellite in 1983 and was the first talk show on satellite, long before there was a Sean Hannity, long before there was a Rush Limbaugh. He did that in large part because he wanted to provide an end run. Some of you with gray hair, shake your head if you agree with me. If Walter Cronkite said it, it was true. That was the only view out there, right? Is that the case anymore? Not hardly. Talk radio, social media. It used to be just the big three networks. And we are able to have much more information. And really, again, you won't hear me quoting too often Thomas Friedman in a positive way, but he did write a book called The Flat World, in which he talks about the fact that we really have a flat world. That is, the barriers don't exist anymore. If you get on your smartphone right now, you have access to all the digitized information in the world. And if you have gone to some of these town hall meetings, maybe you've treated Michael Burgess pretty nice, but if you go to some of the others, say some of our Dallas representatives and some of those, and you see people in the audience, and they in some cases know more about the issues than the representatives, which sometimes isn't saying a whole lot. But anyway, nevertheless illustrates again the power of technology. And so I'm hoping, if nothing else, this gave you a little bit of an encouragement. Yes, we have some really negative trends that we're going to have to overcome, but I think there are some really positive ones as well. For just a few minutes, though, I did want to talk about, I think, the need for us to, if we're going to really have an impact in this pro-family arena, we're going to have to recapture what used to be the role of churches in America and the role of pastors in America. You can think about, for example, that when we had the Great Awakening, this was something that many people believed led to the American Revolution. And Jonathan Edwards talked about a revival that broke out. And you had George Whitefield, who traveled up and down the eastern seaboard, and you can see that many believe that what preceded the American Revolution were those who were really speaking to the issues. And then years later, after the American Revolution, I thought it was very interesting that John Adams wrote a seminal essay in 1818 about the meaning of the American Revolution. And he listed those individuals which he felt were most responsible for the American Revolution. Now, I bet if you went to the history department of SMU today and you ask, okay, who were the people most responsible for the American Revolution? I don't know, they might say the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, might say Samuel Adams. But the man that was there, the first vice president of the United States, the second president of the United States, the father of another president of the United States, said no, two men that he thought were most influential in the American Revolution were what? Jonathan Mayhew and Dr. Cooper. And I suspect that unless maybe David Barton or two or three of his other friends are in the room, most of you say, I don't even know who these people are. Well, let's talk about them for just a minute. Jonathan Mayhew was a minister of West Church in Boston, and he actually wrote one of the most famous sermons. He delivered the sermon, then these copies of the sermon were sent all through the eastern seaboard, and it was about civil disobedience. Is there ever a time when the church and believers could disobey government? And so he set the foundation, the theological foundation for the American Revolution. Then, of course, you have Samuel Cooper, a minister at Brattle Street Church. You might know some of the people that were in his congregation. I just mentioned one or two. Some of the Adams were there. Some of those were the Minutemen. And so that I don't just take Boston, let's do one from Virginia. And that is the story of Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. And if you're not familiar with his story, he was a Lutheran pastor who actually served in Virginia in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. Anybody ever been to Williamsburg? If you ever have, you've actually sat right where he sat, right there. And so as he is sitting there now, they bring a story about the fact that the troops have been fired upon. And so now he gets on his horse in Williamsburg and travels from, which is kind of the southeast part of Virginia, to the northeast part of Virginia, to Woodstock. He arrives Saturday night, and now he's in the pulpit Sunday morning. Well, nobody's heard the story. There's no CNN, there's no social media. So he stands in the pulpit, interestingly enough, and begins, as he is preaching on Ecclesiastes 3, to talk about the fact that we are going to enter into a revolution. And there's a time for war, time for peace, and a time for war. Well, then, interestingly enough, he stands at the back of the church, and you've seen this painting before, in which he takes off his vestry garments. And underneath, you can see that he is now an officer in the American Revolution. And he calls for the men to join him, and 300 of those men, interestingly enough, join him. And he eventually becomes a major general in the Continental Army. A lot of people say, well, we can't mix politics and religion. Certainly can't have a pastor actually being in the military and fighting in the Revolution. Well, he actually did. And interestingly enough, his brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran pastor in Manhattan, we have the correspondence back. And Frederick says, well, what are you doing? A pastor cannot get involved in political issues. A pastor cannot join the military. And John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg writes back to him and said, oh, yes. Because I stand for liberty, you are able to stand in your pulpit. But not for very long, because then all the ships come into New York. George Washington flees into New Jersey, and so does Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And now he begins to rethink whether or not pastors should speak to these moral issues. And after the Revolutionary War, interestingly enough, he was elected, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, to Congress, and so his brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. If you've ever been to the Capitol, you remember those statues they have there? You got pictures of both of them. I don't know if you've ever been able to go into the speaker's area, but if you go into the speaker's chamber, as you walk in, turn around, you will see that the largest picture there is of Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who became the first Speaker of the House. The point I'm making is that in the past, pastors understood how important it was to address these issues. You know, when I was at Georgetown University, one of the things we studied were these political sermons that were actually produced during that time, and studies done by one of my major professors at Georgetown, as well as people at LSU, University of Houston, found that as they went back and looked at the writings of those in the founding era, 34% of the quotes in their letters to each other came from the Bible. And interesting enough, most of those came from the reprinted sermons of the day. In other words, those who were writing the Constitution were actually quoting from the sermons of the pastors of the 18th century. Imagine if we were to write a Constitution today. Matter of fact, we sort of need to. We don't seem to be using the one we got, right? But imagine if we were to write one. Do you think that the political class would be paying attention to the sermons of our pastors? Probably not. For one reason, a lot of pastors don't address those issues, and number two, the political class does not care. But if you go back, you can make very direct connections between some of the sermons of the 18th century and some of the elements in the United States Constitution. As a matter of fact, during that period of time, they would oftentimes preach sermons. There are all sorts of sermons that they would give to prepare their congregation to vote. This is a sermon that was delivered before John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and it was, again, an illustration of these election sermons that were done to prepare people to use godly wisdom when they would go to the election place and vote. Oftentimes they would even have various kinds of sermons after there was a natural disaster. What was God trying to teach us in the midst of all of this? They would ask, indeed, is there some kind of spiritual lesson that we can learn? And finally, I think we could also say that if you want to look at many of the social movements in America, a lot of them came from what? The pulpits of America. Preaching against social ills, things like the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, even the civil rights movement. And I think if nothing else, if we're going to be successful in these pro-family issues, we're going to have to encourage those in churches and pastors to really address those issues. And so I hope you will take some of this back even to your church or your congregation and encourage them to go out there and address those issues. So finally, just before I open up for some questions, let's talk about some of the issues that we need to address. And certainly one of those is the issue of abortion. Yesterday we had Marjorie Denton on, and we had Frank Cannon on. Of course, a little bit later we had Louis Gohmert on. Earlier in the week, interestingly enough, we had Phyllis Schlafly on. Isn't it amazing? Phyllis Schlafly is 90 years of age. Tell me another 90-year-old you would allow to be on live radio. She has not missed a beat, and she is 90 years of age, born in 1924. We had Sherry Richard. A lot of these are abortion issues, and I think here's a good example where Texas can lead the rest of the country. Because we have shown that, yes, indeed, you can ban abortions after the 20th week. Yes, you can demand that abortion clinics actually, indeed, have to have surgical procedures, and we can begin to reduce the number of abortions. And that, I think, is going to be something we can begin to do at the statewide level. And again, I talked about the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. Here's another one. There are many more crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers in America than there are abortion clinics in America. We're winning the war of ideas. Let's take another one, and we'll look at the end-of-life issues. And Diana, you're going to come up here in just a minute, and we'll get into some of that. But again, this is something to pay attention to because, unfortunately, we have seen a trend, first in Europe and the Netherlands. But even now, this week, I had Colin Gunn on his latest documentary entitled Wait Till It's Free. If you think healthcare is expensive now, wait till it's free. But because he is from Scotland, he spent some time over in England talking about the fact that oftentimes they will bring an elderly person into the British health system. They'll put that individual on a morphine drip, not feed them, and lo and behold, by the weekend, they died. But it really, essentially, is active euthanasia. Now, that would never happen in the United States, would it? Oh, wow. How about just where I'm going to be next week at this time, Oregon, where you have physician-assisted suicide. You have essentially, with physician-assisted suicide in Oregon, what you've had in the Netherlands for many years. And in one of my books there, we document quite a bit on the number of individuals who were put to death without their consent. Most of those over in Europe, but some of that is coming over here as well. It's done sort of behind the scenes, but we have to pay attention to that. I don't want to steal Diane's thunder, so let me move on to another one, and that is to get to the issue, of course, of health care. And I put up some of those. You know, our good friends at Liberty Institute recognize how important it is to defend, I've got a picture here of Hobby Lobby and then the Little Sisters of the Poor. If you don't sometimes just shake your head, really, the Department of Health and Human Services wants to force the Little Sisters of the Poor to buy contraceptives? Now, there's a sexually active group for you, isn't it? I mean, you just see how awful this has become. And Kelly Shackelford, who's with us almost every Friday, so we just say it so often. I know it's getting to be trite, but you just can't make some of this up. And it just illustrates, again, what we are facing. And so who would have thought that health care would be a battleground for many of our pro-family issues as well? And so that's certainly one of those issues we'll have to address. Some of the church-state issues we can talk about as well. We've already heard about a few of those, but again, even this last week, you just go example after example after example, whether it's the schools and whether or not you can put a cross on the back of a helmet for Arkansas State, whether it's the principal who told the students that they, for example, in one particular locale could not wear an American flag t-shirt because the Hispanic students might be upset about that. Another principal who told the kids that actually had flags on their trucks on 9/11 that was inappropriate and removed all the flags. I mean, we can go on and on and on about all of these stories in the schools. But again, the biggest concern I still think, and we again want to support Liberty Institute, is Mount Soledad. If they tell us that that cross in San Diego has to come down, what about the crosses in Arlington Cemetery? If they tell us that we can no longer have a public display of religious liberty, then you better invest in a sandblasting company in Washington, D.C., because they're going to have to sandblast every one of those monuments and every one of those buildings. We have no idea what could unfold. The good news is our good friends at Liberty Institute and Liberty Council, Americans that are involved for justice, and a variety of other organizations have been so successful. As a matter of fact, it's really kind of a mismatch. Liberty Institute always wins their cases. People for the separation of church and state and people against religion and those kinds of type of organizations all seem to be losing pretty much. Same-sex marriage, there's a pro-family issue for you, and I'll open up for some questions just a minute to let you react to some of those. But again, how that is going to be an essential issue, and right now I appreciate the fact that we have an attorney general now running for governor who says, you know, I don't care if you got married in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We don't recognize the marriage, so don't come down here to Texas and then say that you need a divorce, because we don't recognize the marriage in the first place. But they were trying to find a de facto way to actually legalize same-sex marriage in every state, and I think we're going to see that as well. And finally, just one more issue before we open it up for some questions, the issue of poverty and welfare. This is the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. So after 50 years, how are we doing on that war? Kind of losing, you know. We fought the war on poverty and the taxpayers lost. We have spent trillions and trillions of dollars in the war on poverty, and the poverty level has hardly dropped. Now, I will be honest to say that people living in poverty today are actually doing much better than people that were living in poverty in 1964. Almost all of them have color televisions, almost all of them have air conditioning. Virtually every single one of them have a cell phone, so obviously they're doing a little bit better, but still, is this the best way to address poverty? Or, again, pro-family, church, faith-based initiatives, are there better ways to address that? So let me open up for some questions you might have. I got some of my books in the back, and Ron will be there, and Ron's got a deal. You can get each book for $10, you can get all 5 for $50, I guess is what he's saying right now. I was saying, why can't you make it 45 just to make it look like a deal? Anyway, let's take some questions real quickly, and everybody step me up when you need me to end, okay? Yes? And I think you could probably say, I know I'm going to sound like an academic, it's probably both. Now, I think generally the economic environment provides more opportunity for entrepreneurship. Why is it that Boeing decided that they were going to build their next super jet down in South Carolina instead of in Washington? You know, part of that is not taxes, because Washington is not a state tax state, but it had to do with the right to work laws and things of that nature. So obviously, a better economic environment draws people to that. But there's also the other part of that people that have more of an emphasis on freedom and entrepreneurship are more likely to pass some of those laws. So I think it's both and, but I would have to weigh more in the fact that once you create the environment, more people have opportunity. And you can imagine what we could do if we were to get rid of many of those regulations, which we were just talking about a minute ago. You would even have more startup companies and more opportunities for economic dynamism, because there would be more venture capital, people would be more willing to risk it. And again, you might even draw people there that originally might have even supported right to work laws, but after living in a state for a while where they have a lot more economic freedom, say, maybe I'm going to change my mind. That's the enculturation that takes place. We all say, well, we have all these New Yorkers moving down to Texas, it's going to turn it blue. Maybe. How about we just turn some of those blue people red and keep them in the state? Make sense? We've got a laboratory. You know, I was growing up in California. One of the first autographs I ever got was from Governor Ronald Reagan. He used to refer to that as what? Laboratories for democracy. So let's just show that our laboratory works, and let's convince some of these other states to follow suit. And look really what Scott Walker is doing in Wisconsin. You talk about a difficult economic set of circumstances, and look how well he's done. We just need more Scott Walkers out there, and we'll be, I think, changing the nature of the country. Some other questions real quickly, or do we need to end? How are we doing on time? One more. I don't see another question, so I guess we covered it all pretty well. Well, again, PDFs in the back. Okay, last question. Okay, Point of View is on about 340 radio stations. Locally, you can hear it in the daytime on 1480, from 1 to 3 on AM 1480. Or at night, you can hear it at 10 p.m. on American Family Radio, which is 90.5. So again, 1 to 3 for the afternoon. Or at night, you can hear it at 10 o'clock on 90.5 FM. So 1480, 90.5. We're on about 340 stations. We just did the latest Arbitron. About 1.44 million listen to the program. And actually, we're much stronger outside of the state of Texas because we're on some rather small stations right at the moment here. But from Maine to Florida, all the way from California, all the way to Alaska. Matter of fact, our northernmost station is North Pole, Alaska, KJNP, North Pole, Alaska. Bill, thank you very much.